In this video tutorial, we're going to have a quick look at creating wireframes, which is just one of the ways that we can represent a user interface design to mainly to our non-technical clients, or perhaps it's to developers, but it's one of the ways that we can communicate our application's user interface as part of the design phase of the software development lifecycle. So this is something that we would do before we get into the development or the coding phase for something. This is part of design. And the idea is that we need to be clear as developers what are the requirements of this application. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about a mobile application, a web app, a desktop app, whatever it happens to be, we need to be really clear about what are the requirements of it and to make sure that the client is on board with it as well, or whoever your key stakeholders are on the other side. So I've got up on the screen here 4 different ways that we can represent user interface designs, or ways that we can communicate them to our clients. The first one would be storyboarding. The second one would be using wireframes. The third one, something called a design concept, and the fourth one being prototyping. Now, these 4 different terms or different ways of representing user interfaces, they have a lot of overlap, they have a lot of gray areas, and people interpret them very, very differently. So please just understand that this is a lot of my personal experience and views coming into this, as I'm going to try to distinguish one from another. Mainly from my experience as a web developer, but also from a bit on the mobile app side of things and desktop app as well. So what are these 4 things, and why would we use them? Why do we need to communicate? So very, very importantly, I just want to reiterate that the reason why we would use any of these techniques to communicate the user interface for an app is I, as a developer, do not want to start building an application unless I am confident that I'm on the right page. I don't want to go and create a whole lot of screens or bits of functionality that the client doesn't want or doesn't need. And I want to make sure before I start writing any code that the client and I are on the same page, or the key stakeholders and I are on the same page about where we're heading with this. All 4 of these techniques are a great way of making sure that we've both understood and have agreed on all of the functional requirements of the application. And not just what the application needs to do, but what are these different screens or pages going to look like, which is a great way of agreeing on functionality. If I'm looking at a list of bullet point items saying these are the functional requirements of the application, or a use case diagram or something, they are really good, but they're not very effective at communicating this is what the final application is going to look like and feel like. And that's where all of these techniques come in. All of these will clearly demonstrate this is what the user interface will look like. This is what you can expect when the application is finalized and built and delivered to you. And if this isn't what you want, tell me now so that we can pivot and go and change the requirements instead. So I'm going to quickly try to explain what each of these 4 different techniques are: storyboarding, wireframing, design concepts, and prototyping, and how I think they're different from one another. So first things first, what on earth is a storyboard? So a storyboard is something like what I've got displaying up here now. Storyboarding is something which is used a lot in animation areas, and also with things like children's books or any books that have pictures within them. The idea of a storyboard is to break down a story. So it could be an entire movie, it could be a TV advertisement, it could be a book, whatever. The idea is to break down an entire story into its rough components, its major scenes or its major frames, in order to communicate quickly, this is what I'm picturing for the entire story. This is what I think the whole thing is going to look like when it's finished. Now, obviously, this is not the finished advertisement or animation or whatever it happens to be. This is obviously just 9 individual drawings of scenes or parts from this animation, and some sort of comments underneath it. So storyboards are often developed with this storyboard template and this is a very basic one, but basically you have an image. this is what this particular frame or scene is going to look like. You might also have descriptions underneath. So this might be the script, whatever the actors or characters are going to be saying. It could be sound effects. It could be the type of shots being used. So if it's going to be a close shot or if it's going to be panning or whatever. It could be timing. So how long are we expecting this scene to stay up there for, and any other details about it. But the idea is that there is only a fairly brief sketch of what this scene or frame looks like, and then there's some assisting text to give us an idea. Now, why would someone do this? Why would they create a storyboard? Because we don't want to go ahead and try to create a finished animation or a TV ad for, however long it's going to take, without being on the same page as the director or the client or whoever it happens to be. So what are we going to do? We're going to sketch out roughly each of the scenes of the advertisement or the animation, and then give it to them and say, look, is this what you were thinking? And sit down with them and explain it all. But if they say, no, I wasn't really thinking about this thing, or can we make it so that it really focuses on their face more and not with this speech bubble or dream thought bubble thing? Or I don't really like what you've done here. Can you sort of revisit, scenes 4, 5, and 6, or frames 4, 5, and 6? Now, if you've only spent 30 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes or 10 minutes on each of these little sketches, then your answer is sure, I can revisit that. I can change whatever you would like, right? We can pivot. We can adjust what we were going to do really easily. But if you've spent hours or days finally creating and finalizing one of these particular frames, then your answer about can we change it is no. So the idea of something like a storyboard is to be quick. It's to try to effectively communicate the idea of where we're heading, but not to have invested too much time or effort so that we can scrap everything and start over. So storyboarding, wireframes, prototyping, ideally, and even to some degree design concepts, they're all meant to be quite quick. And the idea is that we haven't started building anything yet, so we can go back to the drawing board, quite literally in this case, and think about another way of implementing it. So with our applications, I don't want to go and spend all my time writing lots and lots of code to develop these 3 different screens of the app, to have the client turn around and say, oh, no, I don't like these 3 screens. This isn't what I was thinking at all. You need to go and recreate them all together. Because I've spent days and days doing this stuff. But if I've just spent, an hour at an upper estimate of sketching out what the 3 screens are going to look like, of course I can go and change that. That's no real impact to me. Anyway, this is where storyboards come from. This is an example of using one, obviously not for an application, but this is where we can implement the same technique for a mobile app, web app, whatever it happens to be. So just keep this in mind. But what we're talking about with a storyboard is it's probably sketchy, like literally hand sketched. That's one of the sort of main distinguishing factors in my mind about a storyboard. Usually a storyboard is going to show the flow or the story in something, and that doesn't communicate overly well to a lot of applications. So we can show how one page or screen transitions into another, but obviously the concept of a story doesn't exist quite as much with a website or an app. And storyboards often do range from low to high fidelity. So fidelity is just talking about the level of detail or the amount of quality that's in something. So some storyboards will be quite low fidelity. They're quite sketchy, especially if I'm doing them because I don't have much of an artistic ability. Some of them will be actually really quite high fidelity. So they'll have very carefully drawn out scenes. The characters will actually be quite identifiable. There might be a whole lot of sketching and shading and stuff that's being used in there. There might be a lot of detail and a lot of depth. Other times it's more like this. So obviously this has not been too carefully drawn. It's just a fairly low or mid fidelity kind of storyboard. Okay, on to the next one. Wireframing. So just to bring you back here, so this is where we're heading. So we talked about storyboarding, and now we're talking about wireframing. So wireframing is another technique which often people have heard of or have seen being used for something like 3D animations. And it quite literally comes from having a wire frame that is built or constructed before adding extra layers on top of that. Now, if you were doing 3D modeling, and you were going to turn that into a 3D animation, or you're going to render that model, you don't really want to think about things like skin textures and hair and lighting and everything else at the start. What you want to think about to start with is just, what is the shape? What is the model that I'm creating? And so often you will have this wireframe kind of mesh that people will be using when they're wireframing something or when they're modeling something. And the idea is that, yeah, we just don't care about all the textures and all the lighting and how this interacts with the rest of the environment. We just want to think about the shape. Like, what is the rough model that I'm creating? And once I've got that model established and agreed on, then we can talk about skin and hair and lighting and environment and everything else. But until that point in time, it's just not relevant. And we also see this being used quite a lot when people are building physical models for things, or things like floats for parades. They literally start out with a wire mesh, and they say, like, this is the shape, this is the overall size or shape of what I'm creating, and then they'll go in and they'll start layering on different materials over the top and designing it and building up from there. So again, wireframing is just a technique of trying to communicate or develop a rough model of something to start with, not thinking about things like colors and textures and everything else, but just to communicate a rough idea of, this is what it's going to look like, this is how it's going to feel later on. Now, of course, a giant T-Rex as a 3D model doesn't translate that well across to mobile and web apps. So we are more thinking about something like this for wireframing. Now, you might be looking at this saying, well, this looks an awful lot like a storyboard, or what I imagined a storyboard would look like for a mobile app. And this is where there's a huge amount of crossover. And quite honestly, people will use the term storyboard and wireframe interchangeably for things like web and mobile apps. And fair enough, there's not a huge distinguishing there's not much of a distinction between the two for apps. So if we were talking about animation, there's going to be a difference. But with apps, there's not a huge amount of difference. But with a wireframe, these things generally are not going to be, they can be hand-drawn, but often these are more going to be machine developed or developed on a computer. So in my mind, I kind of think storyboards are more likely to be sketchy. They're going to be hand-drawn, whereas wireframes are probably more going to be computer-generated. And with wireframes, we're probably thinking more about low to mid fidelity, so low detail generally. As in, I'm not going to go, because I'm not sketching things by hand, I'm probably going to use things like these image placeholders a lot more than I would have been with a storyboard. So with wireframing, some systems actually have a bit of a sort of symbol library that they will use for wireframing, and one of them is this square or rectangle that has the cross through it, which basically just means this is an image placeholder. This is where an image is going to go, but I can't be bothered putting in an image or trying to sketch it out now because that's not worth my time. And it doesn't help me as a client or me as a developer. If I'm looking at a wireframe, I don't need to know what the image is. I just need to be able to get the idea, okay, for each of these topics, there's an image, and then there's some sort of like topic name or something underneath, and that's going to be one card or one sort of element of the application. There's obviously going to be a heading up here, and you can see that they've actually put in words of topics because that's very helpful to communicate what this entire screen is about. They have put in an icon up the top here because that's quite important by itself to communicate, well, this is probably going off to a profile or an account area. And then, of course, up the top, we've got this search bar, and they have put in the word search because that, again, helps to communicate this is for searching. But other areas, they might not have actually put in text. Now, this is quite a low quality image, but you might be able to see that this is not really text. This is just some kind of placeholder, some kind of filler. Because over here, underneath all tutors, we don't really need to know what these details are. So there's probably a name, maybe a description, something like that. I don't care. It's not relevant for now. All we need to know is that there's a page or a screen that lists all tutors. Looks like there's going to be some sort of filter, and then we're just going to have a listing of all the tutors. And the rest, we can decide on the details later. So you can see again that the wireframe is fulfilling that duty of I don't want to spend too much time doing my wireframe, but I still want to be able to clearly communicate the user interface design to my non-technical client or also to a series of developers, but without wasting too much time on it. Because if a client turns around and says, I don't know about this, like before we get started, area of this second screen, this isn't what I had in mind at all. Can we change that, or can we move it somewhere else? If you've only spent, a few minutes on this, sure, we can move it somewhere else. It's probably just a cut and paste operation or something. We haven't invested too much into it, so we're still willing to change it. Yet it's still a very, very good communication tool. And you can see again, if I was to give this to my client and then I went away for a couple of months and built an application, the final application that I give to my client, it's going to be very easy for them to see whether or not the final app matches the wireframe that I provided to them originally. So straight away, they should be able to see, oh, right, yep, here are all the screens that you had documented in your wireframe. They look the same as that, and therefore you've built the thing that we agreed to. And so wireframing, I think, in my opinion, is a really good way of establishing some sort of contract with the client as well. Because if you provide a wireframe that clearly shows all the screens of the app that you're creating, and then you go and build and the client signs off on it and says, yes, these are all the screens, this is exactly what's going to be involved in this phase of the project, they sign off on it. If you go away and build screens that match that and it works, then you've fulfilled your contract essentially. If they come back and say, oh, where's this screen and where's this one and why does this one look like this, and you say, well, that's exactly what was in the wireframe, obviously then it's easy to see that they've added or they've redefined the scope for the project. Anyway, so I think wireframes are great for being able to communicate fairly quickly but very confidently and clearly, this is what the application is going to look like. This is what you should expect for the user interface. And yeah, this is one example of a wireframe. These are just some of the assets, the different symbols or the different library that you might be using for some wireframes. So you can see here that this little symbol here means it's an image placeholder for this particular place where I was looking for it, this Code Academy course. This is we could obviously see that this is an image placeholder again, but because it has a play symbol on it, they're meaning that this is where a video is going to go. Link is just going to be text with an underline because that's a default on the web. We can put in different icons around the place. Headings are going to be just large text. Search, you might put in a little magnifier. Things like drop-down lists are very useful to put a little arrow on, because straight away that does communicate something important to the client that, oh yes, that's a list that someone can select, as opposed to just being a text field or something. But what you can see from this is that these symbols don't take any time to learn for me as a developer or a designer who's putting together a wireframe, and also for the client. Someone can look at this and intuitively understand, oh, I understand that that's a link, or I understand that that's an image, or I understand that that's a drop-down list, because we're just very simply representing what they would be seeing in a website or a mobile app anyway. And so here's another example of something which was listed as a wireframe. Now, again, whether or not you would consider this to be a wireframe or a storyboard or whatever, the idea is still there. This is hand-drawn, but you can see that there are image placeholders in there. Sometimes they can't be bothered writing the words out, so they just put in some lines or some squiggles. At other stages, they do write out words because those are very important in communicating what this screen is about. So if you don't write a title at the top, how am I supposed to know what this screen is? If you don't put search in here, that might be confusing. But if you've got a screen that's titled product, and then you've got a search, and then you've got a listing of things, and each one seems to have an image or whatever, well then I'm going to assume that it's an image, it's a list of products. So you probably don't need to write in product name and description or something under there. But you can see that in this case, because they were sketching it by hand, they have put in icons to help communicate what the different screens of the app would be, all the different components in there. But you can basically see that this is a wireframe. Now, I don't know how good your drawing ability is, but this kind of thing is not going to take that long to actually draw out. And so if someone requests a change, you're probably going to be quite happy to make the change. The main thing is thinking about what do I want to look at, what do I need to be able to see within these pages or screens, and to be able to scribble that down. But the actual drawing of it is not going to take much time. Anyway, so here's another example of a wireframe. So storyboards, wireframes, they will take on different forms, but both of them are going to be very, very, very similar in how they're represented. And honestly, the two terms as far as mobile and web apps go are basically interchangeable. As I said, in my mind, storyboards are quite sketchy, as in hand-drawn. Wireframes are probably more computery. Storyboards are low to high fidelity, so they could be high quality. Wireframes, on the other hand, tend to be low to mid fidelity or quality. They tend not to have a huge amount of detail because that's not what wireframes are about. But apart from that, they're very similar. I can't believe I forgot to mention this, but with wireframes in particular, I must stress, you do not worry about color or typography or specific images with wireframes. That is not what they're designed for. You might notice that all the wireframes we've seen, so obviously this one was hand-drawn, so you're limited to the color of the paper and the color of the pen, quite similar to this storyboard. But you might notice that this wireframe purposely doesn't make use of any color. It's all just going to be black and gray. Because if you start worrying about color, you're wasting your time. That's not what wireframes are about. Wireframes are all about just seeing what are the screens or the pages of my app, what is the positioning or location of the major elements, so what is the layout of a particular screen, and then kind of what is the order or the purpose of each screen. They are not about color, they are not about typography, like font choices, and they're not about specific images. So don't bother going around looking for like, oh, what are some really appropriate images for each of these topics, or what are some really good images for these particular products. Don't worry about it. If you're doing that, you're wasting your time, because as soon as the client says, no, that's not what I was thinking, well, you're just going to turf all that anyway and then get on with something else. So do not worry about color, typography, or images. Now, the third technique that we're going to talk about is a design concept. Now, this again is these terms do change depending on who's talking about these, but in my mind, and you can follow this up if you want to, but a design concept is going to be much more about high fidelity, not about low or mid fidelity. So the idea is with the design concept is that it's not going to be something that's interactive. It's probably just going to be a static design, basically an image that someone has created to represent the final design that's going to be implemented. So the idea with the design concept is that it should be exactly what the finished product should look like. And I should have actually started off just by showing you an example. So this is a good example of a design concept for a website, right? So obviously this website has some sort of like desktop version, and they're also showing a mobile version that's overlapped. This is very, very different from a storyboard or a wireframe. Firstly, we have color, we have typography, we have specific images. But more than that, you can see that there has been a huge amount more effort that's been put in to this design over a wireframe. This particular design has the client's logo. It's going to be implementing the client's color scheme, right? It's going to be following a style guide. There's going to be careful thought about all of the different icons, the typography, the layout, the amount of white space that's put in, what is going to be in the navigation. It's going to be about everything, and you can see that it's been designed for multiple different screens and everything as well. Design concepts, as I said, should be a very realistic design that looks like the finished product. We don't look at a wireframe and go, oh, that's exactly what the app's going to look like. Because if you get a black and white sketchy looking application as the client, you're probably not going to be very happy. So obviously wireframes are just about showing layout. This is where items are going to display. This is the idea behind each of the screens. It's a rough concept of where we're heading. Design concepts, on the other hand, very, very specific. The exact content, the exact color, the exact typography, the exact positioning. And these design concepts take a long time per design. Well, potentially. But the idea is that someone has sunk a lot of time into this one page. Whereas if you were doing this as a wireframe, we're kind of talking about a few minutes to put this together. You know, here's going to be a title, we're going to put an image over here, and then we're going to put a blob of text in. Well, that probably just took me about 1 minute to put in that content in a wireframe. But in a design concept, that could be an hour, for argument's sake. Maybe not. So there are the first three. So we've talked about storyboards, we've talked about wireframes, and we've talked about design concepts, and where they're very similar and also where they're very different as well. The fourth way of communicating a user interface design is through a prototype. Now this one to me, I think, stands out very differently. I think that a prototype is always interactive. The other three don't have to be interactive, and in fact they are generally not interactive. If you have a storyboard which has been sketched out on a piece of paper, it's not interactive. It's a sketch on a piece of paper. If you have a design concept that's been put together in Photoshop or Figma or something like that, it's not going to be interactive. That's not its purpose. And a wireframe, you know, generally speaking, is not going to be interactive, but there is a bit of crossover I'll talk about in a second. But a prototype is meant to be a minimal functioning version of something, almost like maybe not quite an MVP, a minimal viable product, but the idea is that it should kind of function or feel like the real thing. Now, some prototypes are going to look very, very unfinished, but you click on a button and you go to the next screen, right? Or you can scroll in an area, or you hover over something and something appears, or you pull out from the side of a mobile app and a little menu appears or something. So the idea is that the functionality should be there. So a prototype should be interactive. Now, whether or not it looks finished or whether or not it looks really rough, that would be the difference between like a mid and a high fidelity prototype. And some prototypes are very high fidelity, that they have a lot of detail and they basically look and feel exactly like the finished product. Other prototypes are basically just a wireframe, so quite dodgy looking, but when you click on links or buttons or whatever, you move to the next wireframe. Now, this is where the crossover appears. A lot of wireframing software start to add features in to make them interactive wireframes, which starts to move into the territory of a prototype at that stage. Because if you have one wireframe and you click on a button or whatever it happens to be, you tap on a link or whatever, and you move to the next screen, well, then you're starting to cross over into the territory of a prototype, something which feels like the finished product. And so this is another one of those places where you've got a lot of gray area in between. But in my mind, I would say a prototype is something which is supposed to look and feel like the finished product. So more of a high fidelity, higher detail than something like a wireframe. So almost more like a design concept with interactivity added to it at that stage could be the prototype. But people have very, very different views about that. When I'm creating prototypes in a tool such as Figma, Figma is a design tool which has some really good interactive prototyping functionality added into it, like Adobe XD, Experience Designer. And so maybe that has influenced my decision as well. But yeah, when I see a prototype or when I think of a prototype, I'm more thinking about something which looks like the finished product and has interactivity added to it to make it feel like the finished product as well. But again, creating a prototype in something like Figma is going to take a lot less time than writing it all out in code as well. So when the client turns around and says, oh, can we change this? Can we move these screens around? Can we add another screen in? Can we remove this one? Yes, we can. because that's only going to be the difference of minutes or hours, not days or months to make those changes. So there you go. So there's an overview of 4 different ways to represent a user interface design. In the next part of this tutorial, we're going to get into actually creating wireframes using a very, very simple online tool called wireframe.cc. So I'll see you in the next tutorial.